Hey friends, welcome back. Today I have a very special guest on the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast, my friend Katie Wells. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat today.
So Katie Wells is the founder and CEO of wellnessmama.com and wellness.com. That's wellness with an E. She's a mom of six with a background in journalism, and she took health into her own hands and started researching to find the answers to her health struggles. Now, get this, guys. Katie's written over 1,500 blog posts. She's written 3 books, and she was named one of the 100 most influential people in health and wellness. Whoa, if that's not a dynamo, I don't know what is. How did you get into health and wellness, Katie? I want to start with that. But I think the story that you talk about, the change that spurred you to get in, I think it's really interesting for people to hear too. So I'm excited. Please tell us how you got into health and wellness.
Absolutely. I often heard it said that sometimes people go into psychiatry to kind of figure out their own internal problems. And I think that also holds true for a lot of us in the health world. I actually know very few people who just got into health and wellness because they were in perfect health. Many of us come from some kind of struggle, and that was certainly my case. So I was the type that was very type A, got a lot of stuff in life done early, and was finishing up college at 19 or
Oh,
18 actually, and then met my husband, got married and had a baby in a very short amount of time. And I remember the follow-up appointment after having him. He was 6 weeks old and I was waiting forever in the doctor's office. The doctor, I think, had been at another delivery. So I had read through pretty much everything in this waiting room while I was nursing. And one of the last magazines I picked up, I believe, was Time magazine. And it said, for the first time in 2 centuries, the current generation of American children will have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. And that just was such a stark contrast to me, to be holding this tiny, perfect newborn that was representative of the next generation and reading all of these horrible things that they would face. And somewhat simultaneously, I was in the beginning phases of having some really strange symptoms, which for a long time got written off as like, oh, that's just postpartum, or that's normal after having a baby. Of course it's hard to lose weight. Of course you're tired. You have a newborn. But that kind of, those symptoms kept building. And that ended up being what would be a multi-year search of trying to figure out my own health problems, while side by side having that statistic always in my head of what his generation was going to face, and kind of vowing that I wanted to help change that. I had no idea at the time how I would do that. I just knew that that wasn't okay for my kids or for any kids for the next generation, that we owed it to them to do better. And certainly it's no secret that all of these health problems have been on the rise and our society faces many, many health problems. But I wanted to be part of the change that would create a different future for them. So with my background in journalism, I began researching a whole lot, kind of simultaneously with those two things, trying to figure out my own health answers and also trying to figure out the root of why we were seeing a drastic rise in all of these problems, especially in children, because just like we hadn't seen that shift in children dying before their parents for a very long time, we hadn't seen such a rapid rise in health problems in children ever in history. And anytime something is affecting children in large amounts, to me, that deserves a lot of attention. So I was putting a lot of my research energy there. And I'm a big fan of Richard Feynman, the physicist. And one of the things he talks about, they call it the Feynman technique. The idea that when you learn something, if you can teach it to someone else, it cements it in your brain. And this is something I do with my kids in their homeschool. And so as I was learning, both to help myself internalize and have high recall, and also to share with other moms, I started putting a lot of this information into blog posts, and that's how Wellness Mama was born. And I realized even early on that moms, I believe, are the most powerful force for good on the planet. And if you can get information to the moms and get out of their way, that's how you can change a generation. So I wanted to, as much as possible, get practical, actionable information directly to moms so that we could start having that ripple effect and start making those changes for our kids.
I love that. I love that. So I met you at the Paleo FX conference last year in 2019. It seems like 5 years ago at this point, given what we've been through this year. And I remember we talked for quite a while. So I want to ask you this one question. You've been at this game, Katie, for over 10 years now, in the health and wellness space, blogging, podcasting. Now you're an e-commerce entrepreneur as well. What's changed since you first started to today in terms of society and how they think about wellness?
Yeah, there have been some big shifts, some I think very much for the better, and some that have made things tougher. I know it's been actually almost 14 years since I started Wellness Mama, and in the beginning, I felt like it was kind of the Wild West of health and wellness. Like there was some information out there, but it was hard to find, and it was really hard to vet and know if something was a good source or not. And when you did find something out, it was difficult to find a lot of the things you might want to implement. So it was like supplements were a lot harder to find, even just clean cooking ingredients. I remember when I first started, you couldn't buy coconut oil in a grocery store where I was. I had to order it online.
Wow.
There was no grass-fed meat in any local store where I lived. I had to find it. I felt like it was on the black market. Like I was buying it from a farmer in a parking lot, and like it might have been illegal. I don't know. And so it was much more the Wild West. I think now there's so much mainstream acceptance and at least knowledge of so many ideas. And so the conversation has shifted to maybe discussing the finer points of dialing those things in, and whether this particular protocol is more beneficial, or whether we should be eating in a time restricted window, or whether we should be avoiding certain foods. We're just having much higher level conversations, I think, when it comes to health and wellness. And there's much more widespread availability of a lot of these resources, and a lot of information as well. I think there's two sides to every coin. And I think the flip side of that being there's so much information that many people are often overwhelmed. And that's the thing I hear a lot from my readers and listeners is, how do I know what to actually follow? And especially, like, I have a podcast as well. People will say, like, this guy says one thing, but the guy 3 weeks ago said a different thing. And how do I know what I'm supposed to do?
Right.
I think that's actually been my own recent journey of the last couple of years, is realizing that that is where we find true health, is in that friction. Because for years, I feel like I trying to reverse my Hashimoto's, which in my story, I ended up having Hashimoto's, is now fully in remission. But it took so many years to get a diagnosis, and then so many more years to fully recover from that. I feel like every protocol out there. I found every system. I felt like I had tried every dietary approach and every supplement regimen. And I was so, I was so concerned with getting healthy. I was so consistent. I would follow any system or program. And what I finally realized was, I think there's absolutely wisdom in every one of those approaches. I'm a very big believer that we can learn something from everything we read, every person we meet, every protocol and approach that we find, but almost never does that directly apply one for one to us, because there's so much bio-individuality, and we're learning that even more and more. So while I was looking for a system that could just give me the black and white answers, I was ignoring my own responsibility as my own primary healthcare provider to figure out the system that worked for me. And that all shifted when I started really like paying attention to what my body needed and trying different approaches and keeping the pieces that worked and letting go of the things that didn't work, rather than being so dogmatic about an approach. So I think that the tough part for many people, especially people with a health problem, is there's so much information, it can be overwhelming. And at the end of the day, we're each responsible for figuring those things out, and that can be its own lifelong process in some ways.
Right. And obviously, we've got genetics that we're starting to look into with 23andMe and some of these companies. We're now looking at the prospect of being able to decipher epigenetics in the next few years, hopefully the next 10 years, which will give us more data on what we should be doing. But you're right, like bio-individuality is so different for everybody. And it's hard to say what works for Katie is going to work for me, is going to work for Sam, or everybody else out there. So I 100% agree. And I think listening to your body is a great point that you made. We can do that today, right here, right now. And I want to talk to you about that in a few more questions. Coming back to the point you made about it's really cool to kind of see, at least on the coasts, the availability of grass-fed meat and organic food. And I wish hospitals would actually do a little bit more with that, because last year I went to BLSA, which is the Baltimore Longitudinal Study on Aging. It's like 70-year-old study on aging, and they bring you down for a weekend. They track, $30,000 worth of tests on you. They do these tests, but then they give you coupons to go down to eat lunch, and you go down and there's a salad bar and you're like, yes. So you try to get some salad. And I asked the lady, hey, by the way, is this organic? And I'll never forget the look she gave me. And she said, boy, you must not be from these parts. I was like, oh, yes, I'm not from here. No worries, I'll eat this. So there's more work to be done, especially in healthcare facilities and whatnot, but we have come so far. So thank you for that. Now, I have a question for you. You've got 6 kids, Katie, you and your husband, right? I'm sure there's organized chaos in the house. How do you guys get anything done from an organizational standpoint?
Yeah, this is an area that took me a long time to figure out as well. And a lot of people don't know this. I came close at one point to deleting Wellness Mama and not doing it anymore,
Wow.
because I had gotten to a point where the business was growing. Obviously, my kids were growing. I was homeschooling, and there was so much on my plate. And I just felt like I couldn't keep all the plates in the air anymore. And I was so stressed and overwhelmed all the time. I knew I couldn't keep doing what I was doing, and I knew I couldn't let my family fall through the cracks. So the logical idea was that the business would have to go away. And in that day, I realized that my stress wasn't actually coming from the business side at all. It was coming from the home side. And so I kind of stepped back and asked why was that the case? And what I realized was it's because I was running my business like a business, and I had times that I knew I was going to work. There was a schedule, there were KPIs. I knew what we were working toward. We knew what the goals were, and I had a team involved in helping get there. Yet at home, I was trying to manage 8 people's schedules, dietary needs, emotional needs, clothing choices, doctor's appointments, everything off the top of my head, and taking on the emotional responsibility for all of that. So I kind of asked myself, what if I implemented some of these strategies that make a business successful in the home, and started building in systems, having not just a place for everything in the home, but a time for everything that had to happen. So when it wasn't time for something to happen, I didn't have to think about it. And then also really returning to what's one of our core principles with our kids, which is that we won't do anything for them that they're capable of doing themselves, with the idea we're trying to raise adults, not children. And so building the kids into a very effective team, not that they're helping me with things that need to happen, but that we are all together in a team working toward a common goal, which totally shifted how they felt about being involved in the household. And so now I have kids who cook meals entirely on their own and clean the kitchen and from scratch. And I would say my son, my oldest one, he actually has a cookbook out himself. He's probably far surpassed me, especially in baking or anything very precise. He's very detailed, but he often handles meals by himself. He actually just went hunting and got his first deer and has turned it into all of this meat that he's put in the freezer, and now he's planning to cook all of that. So it wasn't something that happened overnight, but it's been because we're very intentional about our time and our systems, and making sure that we schedule both in business and at home the most important priorities first. I feel like people get this right with business, like the things that have to happen, we try to tackle those first. We know what they are and what they're identified. At home, we often get caught in just putting out fires. And so putting the most important things like family dinner and like just family time in general on the schedule first, and not letting anything interfere with those, whether it's activities, whether it's anything outside, that just helps keep the focus and keep the calm. There's a parenting course called Positive Parenting Solutions. And one of their core ideas is that if you spend even just 10 minutes a day of one-on-one time focused on a child, that often is enough to fill their cup so that they feel seen and heard and valued. And then they're in a much better place to be willing to be part of a team, and they don't need to like do things to get attention the rest of that time. So just implementing a lot of those strategies, and then making sure that our work times are scheduled as well and uninterrupted while the kids are doing their schoolwork or whatever it may be.
Wow. I think any mother and any parent actually would love these tips. So thank you for sharing. Now let's turn our attention to wellness, which you've been in for so long, Katie. If you had to recommend, again, understanding we're different individuals and we respond differently, but if you had to recommend 3 overall wellness tips to the audience, what would those be?
Yeah, I tried to think of ones that would be not require anything really involved or expensive. I think, I know for me at least, for so long it was easy to try to look at the like fancy supplements or the like expensive biohacking device, thinking that was going to be the thing. And I think there's a little bit of humility in learning the lesson that often the core free things, the daily choices, are the things that make all of the difference. So these probably are not going to be your typical health and wellness tips, but the first one would be like learn to manage light. And this doesn't have to cost any money. It's just becoming cognizant. Like we think of the inputs of food and exercise, and even now, thankfully, most people think of sleep as a very important health input. But I think because we can't necessarily always feel the immediate effect, we often discount just how important light is. And there's 2 parts to that, both the importance of natural light and the potential problems with too much artificial light. I don't think either of them is necessarily good or bad across the board. It's how we use them. And that's, I think, also a commonality through all of health and wellness. Almost nothing is objectively good or bad. Everything can be a tool. It's how we use it. So the things that I have found most impactful, both in how I feel and actually in measuring my labs over time, is using natural light effectively in the morning and limiting artificial light effectively at night. So one of the best things I do for my health every day is to get outside as soon as possible after waking up, even if it's a cloudy day. We know that we see such a wider spectrum of light outdoors, even on a cloudy day, than we do inside, even with the brightest lights. And like I said, that's one we don't necessarily feel immediately, so it's easy to discount. But that outdoor light hits specialized receptors in the eyes that trigger a whole cascade of healthy hormones that carry over even into creating more melatonin that night for sleep. And over time, we build much healthier cortisol patterns and stress patterns by using light to our advantage. I think there's also an advantage to getting back outside whenever possible, sometime during midday. And again, this doesn't have to be to get a tan or to spend a lot of time, but hopefully to get some vitamin D as well. But vitamin D is just one part of the many, many benefits of sunlight. And I think just like many of us are overfed but undernourished, I think many of us are deficient in getting enough sunlight. And we know that all those spectrums, especially during the bright part of the day, that stimulates things like proper mitochondrial function and creation of ATP, which is basically the body's energy currency. And so without that, of course, we can hit fatigue and feel that slump in the afternoon. We turn to caffeine instead of turning to maybe hydration and sunlight. We also know, for instance, there's fascinating data, like when we wear sunglasses all the time, we're blocking those light signaling devices from happening, and we're blunting that whole hormone cascade. There's even really fascinating things like when you wear sunglasses, you're actually more likely to get sunburned. You wouldn't think those things would be connected, but it's because when the light hits those parts in your eye, it starts that hormone cascade that signals the body that you're in the sun, and so to create melanin and to protect the body and to create vitamin D. And the body gets confused when it's thinking it's dark outside because we're wearing sunglasses, but our skin's getting light. So becoming aware of our light patterns truly can be a profoundly impactful thing. And then the other side of that being at nighttime, that would be time in nature when our body would not have encountered bright light, and especially not blue light. Blue light would happen most often midday from the bright sun and the sky. But many of us were exposed to those bright blue spectrums at night through screens or through daylight bulbs in our home. So just doing an audit and being careful of that. And there's now easy tools. We can run flux on our computers and night mode on our phone. And we can, one trick I do is to put red bulbs in lamps in every room. So after sunset, you can just turn on the lamps with the red spectrums. As a parent, this is a huge tip because when you remove the blue spectrums, you start creating more melatonin. So do your kids. So when you flip on those red lights, within about 30 to 40 minutes, the kids start to get more tired and bedtime starts to get much more easy. So
Nice.
that's one of my really big parenting tips there. But I think thinking of light as just as valuable as an input for our bodies as food or as exercise. I'm also a big proponent of, I would call it optimizing the body's natural detox pathways through movement and sweat, but I don't like to say like exercise necessarily. I think there's a whole lot of different ways to do this. And personally, I found myself, I had for years tried to make myself love running and love cardio and love like, oh, I got to work out for an hour a day. To your point about jeans, turns out my jeans don't like that at all. My jeans would be happy if I never ran more than a quarter of a mile ever again in my whole life. And I'm perfectly happy with that as well. But I do think it's important to sweat and to get all the other benefits of exercise related to heart rate changes and vasodilation and lung capacity. And so I'm now a big proponent of doing high intensity workouts and strength training based on my genes. Again, there's going to be a personalized aspect there, and using the sauna daily. So sauna is not something that necessarily everybody has available. It is one of the things of, as far as health purchases, that I prioritize. Like if I was going to spend money on a health device, sauna would be the top of my list. And mainly because if we look at the data and the current meta-analysis available, if sauna was a pill, we would essentially all take it. Like we have seen from regular sauna use, which they define as 4 to 7 times a week, a reduction in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease risk, stroke, cancer, et cetera, almost across the board. And so that's something I try to incorporate regularly. It's also an exercise mimetic, and it makes the benefits of exercise more effective. So sweating and saunaing post-workout intensifies the benefits of the workout, and as an exercise mimetic, it raises your heart rate, you burn a lot of calories, you're sweating, so your detox pathways are opened, and you're not exerting any more effort. Plus, many times you're in a parasympathetic state when you're in a sauna, so you're getting the healing benefits of resting and relaxing while still also burning more energy. And then for me personally, I also would say like use timing to your advantage. And this is almost across the board with anything health and wellness. I think people look at the what, but not the when. very often. So we look at like all of the supplements we should be taking and or the foods we should or shouldn't eat. And that's the what. And that's important. And we do have to dial that in. But I think I have found the most benefit from the when, even more than the what. So in the last 2 years, I've lost now almost 90 pounds. And
Wow,
um,
congratulations.
thank you. And the fun part is I'm eating more now than I've ever eaten by far. And I'm definitely not even as clean or careful. Like there were times when I was on the autoimmune protocol, I was on the most clean dialed in diet I could possibly have been on. I'm not that at all anymore. And I'm still maintaining or even like still losing fat and adding muscle. And a lot of that goes back to the when. And as Americans, especially, I find we're kind of bad at the when part. We tend to like think like, okay, well, I'll eat less calories, but I'm going to eat half of them at 9 o'clock at night. And then my digestion's going to be bad. My heart rate's going to be up and I'm not going to sleep well, which is going to carry over into blood sugar tomorrow and this whole cascade. So I started looking at the data of not just what I was putting in my body, but how and when. And I implemented some simple strategies that worked for me. I think these will vary person to person, but some of mine are I don't do anything every single day, including take supplements. So my supplements are varied and I don't take supplements on the weekend with the idea I don't want my body to get used to any input all the time.
Right.
With eating, I started practicing a version of time restricted eating that's somewhat close to the idea of circadian fasting, which is that I don't eat when it's dark outside. So right now, it means I don't really eat after 4:30 in the afternoon because of daylight savings. But I typically, for me, have found I feel best when I eat in a 7 to 8 hour window during daylight hours, and that at each meal, so I'll probably eat like 3 meals. They might be 3 to 4 hours apart, but at each meal, I'm getting past my protein threshold. So for me, I found that when I eat more than 30 grams of protein per meal, I not only feel better, but I add muscle more easily. I lose fat more easily. I'm sleeping better. That's kind of been the key for me. So getting enough calories. I think all my years of chronically trying to lose weight, I found I was actually not consuming enough food. So I had to signal my body that we're okay, we're safe, there is food available. There's still gonna be times when we don't eat and I still fast sometimes, but on average, there's plenty of food, there's plenty of nutrients and there's plenty of protein. So go ahead and build muscle and have good fertility and do all the things that you need to do when you know that you're safe and healthy. And then same thing with like sleep. We know the data. We know that sleeping from 2 in the morning to 8 in the morning is not the same as sleeping from, 10 to 4, so timing all of those things has made such a dramatic impact for me, even down to things like when we exercise. Like I don't tend to do as well now exercising first thing in the morning. I do better exercising in the afternoon. I think that is different for everybody, but knowing that has helped me make more efficient use of the time I exercise. And then just kind of like dialing in all of those factors over time. For people who are willing to get more experimental, I'm a big fan of using data to your advantage. So I'm often wearing, like, for instance, the Oura Ring. I'll also be wearing sometimes a band on my wrist to track other variables. For a few months, I've been wearing a glucose monitor to gauge my individual glucose response to food. I think the more data we have, that lets us, again, step into that role of being our own primary healthcare provider, not trying to outsource to an expert who can help us. I think we should all have those people in our corner. We should lean on experts and learn from them. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with us. So becoming our own primary healthcare provider, tracking these things and paying attention to the trends so that over time we can put those systems in place that make things easier and take that guesswork and that struggle out of it.
Yeah, man, love it. There are so many cool tips you just gave the audience, so many. And most of them are free, which I love as well. And I love that in this new trend of health and wellness, we're going back to the basics. We're going back to connecting with nature, which we had forgotten because of the industrial revolution. Food, we don't know where our food comes from anymore. Love that your son's going hunting because he knows where the animal is, how it lives, and how he's eating the animal. So he's connected to the food source. So I love that too. And then in terms of light, it's so cool. Like every morning I go out, get 5 to 10 minutes of sunlight in my eyes, on my face, as you said, the receptors in the eye. And then during the afternoon, I'll take a walk for 10 or 15, take my shirt off, or wear shorts so my legs get the sun to get the vitamin D. And then I'll typically, right before sunset, I'll go for a run or something as well to get that super red light, which helps you calm down. So again, free tips. And then the second thing you said was movement, not necessarily working out. And I think that's a very good distinction because if we study the longest lived communities in the world, they're not going to the gym and lifting weights for an hour a day. They're walking for 10, 20 minutes and they have movement into their whole day. It's just part of their day. They're moving, they're standing, they're tilling the land or they're taking their sheep up the hillside for a walk or grazing or whatever they do. So I love that as well. And then sauna, yeah, I think everybody should do it. It's great on detox. The one thing you mentioned, Katie, in terms of timing and time restricted feeding, you're one of the first people I've talked to that's actually implementing eating with the circadian rhythm, right? Yes, we all talk about intermittent fasting, but what people find easy to do is that, well, I wake up and I have to get into my A-type personality and I have to work really hard. So I'd rather not have breakfast and eat at 2 p.m. or 1 p.m. And now, where you are, it's 2 hours away from the sun setting. So your body is not following that circadian rhythm. How easy or hard is that for you to do, to spend time in the morning making meals and eating them during the day?
It took a little bit of adjustment, but it was easier than I expected, honestly. The biggest challenge for me was I found out on the genetics component, like I don't do well with eggs. I have an IgG reaction to eggs, and I've had that since childhood. So that's the only food I now have to avoid. And that's the easiest protein for breakfast. So I had to get creative with learning to make soups or stir fries in the morning because I have found for me, and I think this is true for a lot of women, hitting that protein threshold, especially in the morning, is really, really important for hormones. Like I notice a drastic difference in my energy level when I get enough protein at my first meal of the day. Even if it's not until a little bit later, like 9 o'clock, I still notice a big difference if I get enough protein then. And I feel like almost it's like a inverse relationship. So the first meal of the day seems to be the most important for getting enough food and the right type of food. And then it gets less important as throughout the day, whereas most of us eat our biggest meal at night after dark, close to bed, and so our body's still putting so much energy toward digestion at nighttime. So it was a little bit of an adjustment, but not really as much as you would expect. And now that it's implemented, it's just an easy system to follow. I use an app called Zero to help track the fasting. So whenever I stop eating at night, I'll start that for at least 16 hours till the next day, which just having something like a timer concrete to look at helps me mentally be like, oh, not time to eat yet. And I'm not worried about it. And then I also track in the positive. This was another big shift. I think in the diet culture, I viewed in some ways certain foods as bad or like calories as bad. I had kind of had this negative relationship with food. And when I was able to make the shift of thinking of food the way more athletes do as fuel versus calories, even though calories are supposed to represent fuel. When I started thinking of it as fuel, it shifted what I was looking for in food. It wasn't about trying to eat less to deprive myself. It was about trying to find the foods that optimize the nutrient per calorie ratio. So like, how can I get the most nutrients in this meal? And I find with protein as well, you're less likely to overeat if you're actually getting enough of the nourishing foods and protein and vegetables that have fiber. Your body's just naturally so much more satiated. And so when I focused on, instead of I can't have these things, I would change it to be, okay, I just need to make sure I get enough of these things. And then if I'm still hungry, I'm going to listen to my body and I'm going to eat more food. But focusing on the nourishment versus the calories and like the weight loss side completely shifted my relationship with food. I think that just that mindset shift alone is a really important one for women. And another health tip I would kind of throw in to add to that past list is audit the questions you ask yourself. I'm convinced more and more that our internal voice and the way we talk to ourselves is one of the most important factors when it comes to health. And I think I've only recently realized just how drastically that was the case. But our mind, and especially our subconscious, has so many scripts that are running constantly to protect us, we often don't realize. So when we're internally asking the questions like, oh, why can't I lose weight? Or why is this so hard for me? Our brain is there to help us, fills in those blanks and says, oh, well, here's all the reasons you can't lose weight. You had 6 kids and you have thyroid disease and blah, 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 blah. Whereas if we shift our internal questions to like, how is this so much fun? Or why do I love healthy food so much? Our brain goes, oh, well, obviously because, and it gives us all those answers. So I think like where we put our energy is where we see our results. So changing that internal dialogue with ourselves and moving from like deprivation or fear or guilt or shame or things being bad, even when it's related to food, to shifting toward I'm nourishing my body and making sure it gets enough food because I respect it and love it. It just changes our whole interaction with food.
Yeah, that's amazing as well. The mindset is, as you said, is the most important. And there's a lot of negative loops that all of us have running in the back of our minds. We're not enough. We're not loved because of this. Like for your instance, you could have said, I have 6 kids. Like there's no way for me to lose weight, right? But you lost 90 pounds in the last 2 years. So if you can do it, anybody can do it. Let's talk about fasting for a second. You mentioned that you're using an app, of course, but you kind of track how long you fast. I've gotten some questions from women that say, is it healthy for women to fast past the 12-hour mark because of how hormones are? So I'd love for you to address, what your fasting protocol is and what you would recommend to other women that are trying to lose weight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a perfect example of us each learning to listen to our body, because for many years I didn't really try fasting very much because I had heard that same thing. Women shouldn't fast. It can mess up your hormones, especially if you have thyroid disease. You should never fast, etc. Even just skipping one meal can throw all of your hormones completely out of whack. Um, in life in general, I've also become a really big proponent of anytime I firmly believe something, asking myself, what if this wasn't true? Or what if the opposite were actually true? I think we can't say we hold a belief until we have at least considered the opposite other viewpoints to be able to be certain that ours is correct. So I started doing this in dietary things as well, in health. And fasting was one of those things that I thought, well, what if the opposite was true? Is there any chance that the opposite could be true? Or is there any part of this that I can learn from, even if adopting a full fasting approach may not be best for me? And so I started very small and experimenting, and I knew the data out there. We've got researchers like Walter Longo and Sachin Panda doing research on time-restricted eating and fasting. And we know for longevity, the results are profound. Granted, many of these studies have been done in men, and they haven't done studies in obviously pregnant or lactating women because they can't. So each of us has to become our own scientist as well. I started very small with just experimenting with that fasting window, and then watching my levels over time. I do take labs every 6 months or so, making sure that I wasn't making anything worse. What I found was my body responded really, really well to that. I think genetics are also a factor. I have quite a few genes that make me probably on average respond to fasting better than a lot of other women. But I also think it was because I started a gradual approach and I didn't shock my body overnight. What I have found works best for me personally, like I said, is to eat kind of in a 7 to 8 hour window most days, but in line with the whole don't do anything every day. There are also days when I eat more calories than I normally would. I eat in a longer window than I normally would. I eat more carbohydrates than I normally would, or more fat. I'm a big fan of metabolic flexibility. To me, the goal should be that my body can handle whatever I throw at it. Whenever I throw it at it, it should be able to run on ketones or glucose or any mixture. And so I've tried very hard to get it to a point of being able to do that. So on an average day, that's typically what I do, but on 1 to 2 days a week, that will change. I also have experimented with more extended water fasting, which I don't think is necessarily good for everyone. It's definitely not good if you're pregnant or nursing. Those would be times not to fast. Those would be times to nourish your body and focus on just nourishing your body. But for me, I think with all the inflammation I had from all of those years of health problems and thyroid disease, plus with all the extra weight I had, I was able to respond really well to water fasting. And again, I started slow, even with just 24-hour fast, and then built up. But I've now done as long as 10 days, and I watched my blood levels throughout all of that. I tracked glucose and ketones throughout. I took labs multiple times, and I worked with my doctor. So I wasn't just in the Wild West fasting by myself, but my body responded really, really well. And over time, because we know, like when we start fasting, we go into a state of autophagy. The body goes into cellular cleanup. Because we're not using our energy on digestion, the body can prioritize that cellular energy in other areas. So for me, I found profound physical benefits from extended fasting, and I now do 5-day fast every couple months, and usually start the year with a 10-day fast. I also find that is largely mental at this point, because I don't have much more weight to lose, and I'm not just worried about that side of it. I feel like my inflammation is low, my body's where I want it to be, but the mental benefits are profound. Because when you remove a variable that is often a 3 times a day variable, not only do you have more time, but I feel like anytime we take away something that we think is so essential for life, it helps us to focus on other things in life that are very important as well. So my ritual in every beginning of the year is I read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and I do a 10-day water fast, and I try to be very present, spend time with family, to journal, to really intention set for the year ahead, because I think when we remove the distraction of food and we actually get to feel hunger, which many of us never get to feel, it's just such a helpful tool for focus. So all that to say, I think it's very individualized, like you mentioned. I think on average, men do respond better to fasting, or at least see fewer negative consequences from extended fasting, even if they don't do it correctly. And that women need to be more careful. But I have found, for me at least, as long as I'm really vigilant to nourish before and after, make sure I'm getting enough kind of almost like feasting before and after to keep calories high, and making sure I'm nourished going in, so I'm not operating from any nutritional deficiencies. I find often, I think, my theory is that these fasting studies that show damage in women, maybe a lot of these women already were had depleted levels of B vitamins, or had methylation issues, or were missing some key nutrient that they didn't have stores of in their body. So when they started fasting, they went into crisis mode because their body was now like critically deficient in something it absolutely needed. Whereas before fasting, I worked with my doctor to make sure I had all of those levels optimized. I found things in my genetics, for instance, that I had a higher need for choline, but I wasn't eating eggs. So I had to supplement several forms of choline, and that made a drastic difference. So I think you have to be intentional and cognizant, but that it can be a very valuable tool if it's used correctly.
Wow, thank you for that breakdown on your fasting and how you're doing it. The 10-day water fast is amazing. I've never done one that long. I remember I started doing fasting a few years ago, and the first day I was deathly scared that I wouldn't be able to fall asleep because I have no food in my system. And once you cross that chasm, you're like, oh, you can fall asleep, no problem. It's not even a big deal. And so, and you know, when people start fasting for the first time, I think day one's bad, day two is bad, day three is horrible, and they want to break down. But then they come out of day three into day four, and they suddenly get more energy. I certainly do every time. And so you just have to go through some of the withdrawal, the pains that your body's throwing at you, the hunger pangs, and then you come out on the other side and everything's very calm. Like you don't even think about eating that much anymore. Like you said, your brain calms down, like your rituals get simpler, you save time, and your body turns on the regenerative engine of your body, which is amazing. You mentioned a couple of things, Katie, genetics a few times. I just wanted to ask real quick, are you using the 23andMe standard tools, or are you exporting that data to other additional tools to get even more genetic data?
Well, I'll have the caveat that I'm a little bit like, I'm cautious when it comes to genetic information, because once it's out there, it's out there. So I actually used one called Nutrition Genome, which I
Mhm.
like because they focus on the nutrition and lifestyle aspects. And we've done that for my husband and I both did it, and we did it for all of our kids. And I did use fake names for them just
Okay,
because I'm
great.
I'm cautious.
Yeah.
Um, but I think there's a lot of helpful data there, and I think we don't still fully, completely understand all of the implications of our genes. And I think that we should have caution in trying to see any gene, especially in a vacuum, and try to fix that, because there's always the risk of throwing others out of balance, or that sometimes just because something's a mutation doesn't mean it's necessarily a harmful one, and learning to use those to our advantage versus fighting them. So we use Nutrition Genome, and then I've also run the self-decode reports
Mhm.
with some additional data. But then I found over time, like a lot of those will give you great information on, for instance, MTHFR. And then they'll say like, okay, because of MTHFR, I feel like I should take methylfolate, and people start taking a bunch of methylfolate, and then other things can get out of whack because
Mhm.
they're like other genes may not need this much folate, or you might need another B vitamin to balance that. And so I've been working on building out kind of a system, trying to figure out so this gene needs more biotin, but you take too much biotin and this one's going to get really upset. So what is the level that I need to take to actually dial that in relation to each other? And I've kind of been building that out. And I think there's a huge degree of personal experimentation there as well. But I think starting with a report like Nutrition Genome, which is like a 100-page report that says like, these are based on your genes, what you can eat and what you can do. That's a great starting point. And then from there, experimenting within the thresholds of each of those things help me really dial in like, okay, these are the supplements that I notice the biggest immediate difference from, and these are the amounts of them that I need to take. And now I know if I like exercise a lot, I need to up this one, or if I'm fasting, like I
Yeah.
want to preload this. I think there's a tremendous amount of data already available in
Mhm.
genetics, and like you said, I think as we learn more and more about epigenetics, we're going to be able to really dial a lot of these in, and not just avoid having the negative ones, but be able to turn on beneficial ones to our advantage.
Great. Okay, so let me ask you this question. Does the wellness mama eat Oreos or cookies or ice cream?
Sometimes, but not every day. I think that was another key for me, is I had to stop labeling any food as black and white bad.
Hmm.
I still will try to choose not just like healthier options, because I feel like that's a very ambiguous term. And there's, as you know, many definitions of healthy. And while most of us agree on 97%, we'll argue to the death about that 3% and whether we should be plant-based or carnivore. Like there's so many
Right.
extremes. So not just about choosing healthier options. I now try to look at is there a way to just make this more nutrient dense? So I'm going to eat something that's sweet. How can I make sure that it's got also nutrients behind it and hopefully maybe like fiber in it? So it's going to be a slowed digestive response. And then now from wearing the glucose monitor, things like if I'm going to eat something that would be higher carb or refined carb or sugar, I know that taking a walk right afterward, even just a gentle walk, blunts that glucose response so much. So I would say other than eggs, which is just because, and I eat duck eggs, but chicken eggs tend to cause an inflammatory response pretty quickly. Other than that, there's no food that black and white I will not eat. I just try to be conscious of those choices, make sure I've already gotten the nutrients I needed for that day, that I'm not missing out on foods my body needs because I'm eating those foods, and also not having guilt attached to those foods if I eat them sometimes. But yeah, other than bananas, I have a fear of bananas. It's not rational and it's not genetic. I'm just afraid of them.
Got it. Katie touched on continuous glucose monitor a couple of times in the interview, and I've used that in the past too. If you're listening, please do the basic tips that Katie shared: sauna, light, sleep. They're way more important than putting a sensor on your arm. But if you get the basics down, I would encourage you to do that, because it tells you your individual response to foods that you love, possibly. And so you can see when you eat that big burrito from Chipotle or the big pizza, three slices of pizza, what the response is going to be for your body. And as a result of monitoring and learning, you can start to tone down some of these things. And you will go take that walk, as Katie mentioned, or you'll add some fats to your food, which blunt the response of glucose, which is helpful and will allow you to live a longer life, which is what we're here for. Katie, we're running out of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you your 1, 2, or 3 top, free if possible, anti-aging or beauty tips.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't want to sound like a broken record, but I would echo the light thing as well. I think in limited amounts. Obviously, we agree none of us should be getting sunburned, but I think if you're well nourished and you're avoiding things like polyunsaturated fats and vegetable oils that can be damaging to the skin and the sun, I think if you're well nourished and you're getting positive daily sunlight, that can be really important for things like collagen production and vitamin D, and things that we know are not just correlated to beauty, but also now to longevity and better outcomes when you get respiratory illness. There's a lot of data there. This is an area I've also been learning a lot of recently, because I'm finally at the age where I feel like I need to start paying attention to my skincare and anti-aging. But I think like other aspects, it's easy to try to focus on, and women maybe especially do this. We try to focus on the topical stuff, like the things we should be putting on our skin to try to help us stop aging. And I think almost always it's what we put in our body that is more beneficial. So I'm learning to become a big fan of a good skincare routine, and I use a lot of natural products there. But more so, I'm realizing if I'm hydrated and I'm getting enough electrolytes, my skin looks a lot better, and that applies to the entire body as well. Like we know, not overhydrating, but proper hydration is important. So I'm a big fan of getting enough water, and also I use something called Element, which is an electrolyte packet. With all the working out I was doing in sauna for a while, I wasn't getting enough of those. And so adding those back in was really helpful. I think also the micronutrient aspect of nourishment from food is really critical when it comes to aging gracefully. I'm not a fan of not aging. I think we're all going to age no matter what, but aging as gracefully as possible. And that is because someone can eat 2,000 calories of any kind of refined food and get almost no nourishment, actual micronutrients, or whereas someone could eat the same amount of like nourishing whole foods and be getting not just so much more volume of food and feel so much more satiated, but also be getting 10 times the micronutrients. And those are the things we need to make sure that our body has the extra resources to produce collagen, to make sure that we're not aging too quickly and that we're not pulling like essential fats from our skin and from our tissues because we're just not consuming enough of them. So I think like that's an area of what we add in internally, not what we put on our skin topically. And then lastly, I would say, I think from what I have found, sleep is probably the best beauty tool I have out there. Like I know I can tell a difference in one day of lack of sleep, in how my skin looks, how I feel, my energy levels. And so I think while it's easy to want there to be a serum that fixes everything, it's much more about those like daily choices long-term over time that let our body function optimally.
I love that. I know that beauty brands have over the last 50 years or so, with their mega budgets, taken over this concept of looking good and aging well as applying a cream or it's a topical or their latest research, right? But as you said, we're learning more and more that slowing down aging has to come from your internal body, what you do inside, the detoxing, the light, some of these natural things that are happening. And of course, there's a lot of molecules that are being developed in aging pathways that we're learning about. We're able to impact those using either diet, supplements, or lifestyle, for example. So one other question for you, Katie. I know that you've recently, or not so recently, launched a wellness brand called Wellness with an E. Please tell the listeners about what's behind the brand, what's the motivation, and what are you serving?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking about this. I'm really excited because for a lot of years, I've been making most of my personal care products at home. That was part of what I researched early on, was that it's not just what we eat that matters, but what we come in contact with. And we know that as the body's largest organ, the skin is a very important mediator of what goes in and out of the body, but yet many of the things we put on the skin enter the bloodstream or enter the body in various ways or store in fatty tissue. And as this has become more widespread knowledge, there are now thankfully more and more non-toxic products out there, which is great. But what I realized was even some of my close friends and readers and listeners who were going to extreme lengths to eat organic and to be very careful about what they cleaned their house with, they were still using commercial brands of hair care and toothpaste. And that was because they were used to these things working a certain way, and they weren't willing to sacrifice how they looked or how they felt in those areas just to go natural. And there were certainly natural brands out there, and some of them have gotten quite good, but a lot of them didn't really rival the conventional brands. And so I realized in order for there to be change there, I had to create alternatives that were not just on par with conventional, but worked better than them, and that also met not just the standards for being non-toxic, because to me that should be the baseline. Like we should not be poisoning ourselves. That should be a given, but should be beneficial from the outside in. So rather than just using the idea of what we put on our body goes in our body as a reason to avoid putting bad stuff on, we should certainly do that. But that also means we can use it to our advantage. So if we absorb often what we put on our skin, why not put beneficial things in these products so that they're actually beneficial from the outside in, and that we're putting the nutrients, for instance, that the scalp needs directly on the scalp, while also hopefully eating a nutrient-dense diet and nourishing from the inside out as well. So that was the core idea behind Wellness. And we started with what I thought would be the toughest ones to tackle. I wanted to tackle those first. So shampoo, conditioner, dry shampoo, and toothpaste. We also have right now a nourishing hand sanitizer, just because with people using hand sanitizer so much, I wanted to provide an option that wouldn't be as bad as many of these just pure alcohol-based ones. So we have that as well right now. But my real passion is in the hair care and oral health especially. That was another area I researched early on when I had some small cavities from what I now realize were nutrient deficiencies in that early stage of Hashimoto's. And again, asked that question, like, can cavities reverse? And the conventional answer being no. And I was like, well, what if that were not true? What if the opposite were true? What would that look like? And ended up having both of those cavities remineralize. And that led to a whole fascinating research area for me in oral health and reading beginning works like Dr. Weston A. Price in nutrition and physical degeneration, up to modern authors like Dr. Stephen Lin. And there's so much amazing data out there right now, realizing that this carries over into every aspect of life. When we nourish the body well, the saliva is mineral rich. We have the fatty acids we need. The teeth even can remineralize if we don't have big cavities that are through to the dentin. So that was an early research project of mine. And that was the idea behind this toothpaste, was to put the minerals that our body needs and hydroxyapatite in the bioavailable form directly in the mouth, with the hope that, of course, people are also nourishing their bodies with what they're eating, and that the two of those things together can help strengthen the teeth over time, making them, ironically, as a byproduct, much whiter, but without the bleaches and peroxide. So these are areas I was really passionate about, and I wanted to get in the hands of other families, because I realized the only way we were going to create change was to give people alternatives that work just as well and that provided benefits.
Awesome. What a great impetus for you to create this brand. I'm going to sign up and be a customer. I'm going to get the oral kit immediately. In terms of the hair products, are they for men, women, or both?
Both. They're for
Both.
both. Women definitely tend to prefer the dry shampoo, although we have a surprising number of guys using it now too. But certainly the shampoo and conditioner are safe actually for the whole family. They're gentle enough even to be used on babies. So
Awesome. All right. I'm going to get those. Katie, where else can people find you online?
I'm easy. I'm Wellness Mama everywhere. So wellnessmama.com, the Wellness Mama podcast, and then social media, I'm Wellness Mama.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the Anti-Aging Hacks Show.
Thanks so much for having me. You're so much fun to talk to.